Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go over warehousing and bins in today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to take a look at how we set up warehouses, how we set up bins, and how materials move around. The first area is going to be site and company configuration because this is going to control the defaults of how the transactions are going to flow. Then we're going to go through warehouse setup, different types of warehouses, setting up zones and teams. If we have a lot of inventory clerks, we may want to break them into different groups or have them work in different zones. And then how we can also have the GL controls tied into warehousing so that we can see how much inventory or how much of our assets are in different areas. Inside every warehouse, we have an array of bins, and we're going to take a look at manually creating them versus using the wizard that Epicor has put into the system. We'll also talk about the sequencing field, and then we'll go over the attributes of aisle, face, elevation. Is it vendor managed? Is it customer managed inventory? We're going to talk about something that's kind of left out of this, and that's called consignment inventory, where we ship it to a customer, but they don't pay for it until they take it from that location. That's a consignment warehouse where it's still our inventory, it's just not in our four wall. But so that we can transfer, how do we get the inventory there? And then how do we enter the shipment when we get the pull notices from the client? The other is consignment for vendors. If we don't purchase the vendor managed or customer managed inventory feature from Epicor, how do we do vendor consignment where Fastenal puts a tool crib or a device in our building and they maintain the inventory level? So we'll talk about that when we go over bins. The final area is going to be the impact on cycle counting, how warehouses impact this. We'll also talk about how price lists work with warehouses. We can set up price lists so that sales gets a different price based on the warehouse that we pull the inventory or the commodity from. And then also how the part tracker works with this. And these screens were fairly simple, so I did static screenshots into the presentation here for today. So our first one is going to be going into company configuration. And right off the details is going to be how we set our default site. We're going to have a default warehouse for the system and a general bin. We're going to have a receiving warehouse and a receiving bin, and then a shipping warehouse and a shipping bin. I have a lot of people that will make this the same as their main warehouse, and they'll just have a bin called receiving or a bin called shipping. By having a separate warehouse for this, when product comes into the receiving area, it gets put into the receiving bin. I may have a few areas or shelves that I put parts on before they get put away. Those would be individual bins inside the receiving warehouse. At the end of the day, when I look at a stock status in the receiving warehouse, there should be no parts left. They should have been put away already. Same thing with the shipping warehouse. When I pull inventory or I pull it from a job and send it to shipping, it should go out the door at the end of the night unless we're staging for the next day. But if I set that up as its own warehouse, I can run a stock status on that warehouse and see what inventory is sitting at shipping to go out the door. Or we can have a shipping bin and then we look at our main warehouse and only look at the one bin, what all is sitting in shipping. It's just not going to tell us where it is in the shipping department because there's only one bin shipping. Once we set up the company configuration, these are the defaults that are going to impact onto transactions as we do them. This is where it's going to pull its information. On the site configuration, we can override the company per location. If we don't set this up, it'll go back to the company setup and use that information. If we override our shipping, receiving, we can have a DMR processing warehouse, an inspection warehouse, and again, our main general warehouse. By having a separate warehouse for QC, I can make sure that all of the bins in that warehouse are non-nettable so that I don't see the financial asset of inventory that I don't know if it's good or bad yet. Raw material, by having that broken out as a receiving, this is what we're doing. This is raw material. That has a different value than a finished good or a value added material. And I am going to bring up the value added material because many people in the Epicor community make sub-assemblies. And those sub-assemblies are not raw material and they're not a finished good, but they have a value to them that is neither raw or finished goods. That value can still be used for financial lending power. After our site configuration, there's an extra area that if we are multi-site, I can also say, how are the warehouses shared between locations? If I'm a single site, you don't really need to set up shared warehouses because you're not sharing them between different plants and locations. If you are multi-site, then we may want to turn around and say this warehouse is shared between both. So if I put an order in Evanston, I can ship from that Evanston warehouse. If I shared the main, I could also ship it from the main at the other location. After we set up the company and site defaults, this is what's going to auto-populate on transactions as we do them throughout the system. Our next area of setup is going to be setting up the warehouses themselves. And I did put the screens in Kinetic for the demos today, only because on the Kinetic screen is where you're going to see some of these new fields, and I highlighted them here. Structured address does not exist on the old classic screens. The ABC codes and GL controls are laid out differently in the Kinetic screen than they were in the classic. If you're not using the classic user interface, you're not going to see some of these new features that were added to warehouses. But we would set up the address that our warehouse is located at, give it a description, we give it a code for the warehouse, who's the manager for the warehouse in the event of having to do a phone call, who manages that warehouse. For the advanced package control, I'll kind of hold that for our lunch and learn when we go over PCIDs. I'll cover the advanced package when we go over PCIDs rather than with warehouse maintenance. Structured elements, a district name, a street name, building. These are additional address elements that were added to the system in the past few versions. Warehouse printers, what printers are available inside this warehouse? So if I want to set up an auto print rule, I'm doing a put away, I need a label for it. I can have that label auto print, but I need to know what printer to send it to based on the warehouse that the transaction was in. My cycle count details are at the bottom of the screen now. Do I use the plant setting for cycle counting or do I override it for this specific warehouse? Do I include or exclude the zero quantity on hand parts? If I don't have inventory, do I need to count them? If I'm doing a full wall to wall, I may want to have the clerk look for the part even though we have zero on hand. Do I exclude negative quantities? Hopefully, we do not allow negative quantities to stay in our warehouse very long. Negative quantities should be addressed as quickly as they're created. If inventory is upside down, an inventory clerk should be going in and adjusting, doing a physical count on that item and updating it so that we're feeding supply chain correctly, as well as having the ability to fulfill our sales orders. ABC codes can be also set up on the warehouse that are different than what we set for the default for the plant. If we set the ABC codes the same for the plant and we don't override it on the warehouse code, everything follows the same rule for ABC code evaluation and for cycle counting rules. Different types of warehouses. I know I brought this up a few minutes ago, but we're going to take a look. Having a raw warehouse allows me to know exactly what do I have in asset value in raw material that was purchased goods. What do I have in finished goods warehouse? This is inventory that I've taken raw material, I've done work, performed work on it, and now I have labor burden, subcontract possibly, and material inside my finished good. That's valued at a different value. I can also have a QA warehouse, as we talked earlier. This is inventory that I don't know if it's good or bad. It's indeterminate. Inside that quality assurance warehouse, I can also look, what was that transaction date of the part when it went in there? How long has it been sitting in QA waiting for a disposition? When I mentioned the assembly warehouse earlier. Having parts that they're not finished goods, but they're not raw material anymore, these are parts that we've done work to. We're going to add them into another job and consume them, but this may be considered like a value add warehouse where we've done some work to it, but it's not a finished goods. Each item in these different warehouses has a different value. That value would go towards our total lending power or borrowing power from the bank, but we need to have that broken out and sorted. Again, the areas that are new is that structured address and the positioning of the GL controls and ABC codes here on the warehouse. If you're not using Kinetic, you're not going to be seeing these. Those ABC codes on inside the warehouse and the cycle count defaults here and our variance tolerances can be overridden on a warehouse by warehouse basis rather than having one setting that applies to the entire plant. This may come in handy if we have an obsolete warehouse. We may want to set the ABC code so that we count the items in obsolete differently than we would count regular moving inventory. So the benefit of having the ABC codes on a warehouse level is different types of warehouses can have different rules. Inside the warehouses, all warehouses are made up by bins within them. Bin naming can be whatever code you want to give it. Bin 001A is the first bin in the warehouse. Giving it a description of what that bin is, this is what's going to print on reports and show on screens. I can choose a zone where that bin is going to be. Is that in the back of the building? Is it in the front of the building? Is it on the east wall? I can break my warehouse into zones, and then when I look at my material queue or my transactions to be processed, I can sort them by those zones and teams. I can specify the size of the bin. I can say this is a 4 foot by 6 foot by 8 foot bin area that I can put parts. If I have a part that's too large, it's not going to fit there. If I already have half of the volume already consumed with parts sitting there, I'm not going to be able to do my put away and put more parts into it because there's only so much room available. Anything to deal with the size would have to be built with its own dashboard or customization so that you can evaluate inventory by volume. There's nothing that turns around and does that natively in the system. The next one, we'll hit these checkboxes before I hit the sequence. Is the bin inactive, meaning we obsoleted this bin. It's no longer there. Is it non-nettable, such as a QC bin? I have vendor DMRs. I have non-conformances. I have RMAs that came in and need inspection. We don't know what the value is, so we can make those non-nettable as well. That's also going to hide the inventory from MRP. So if I have 100 pieces in inventory in a non-nettable bin and MRP says I need to buy 100, it's not going to look at those 100 and say we can use them. It's still going to generate a suggestion for purchasing to buy more because we don't know the state of that inventory, if it's good or bad. The next one is a supportable bin. If we have inventory on carts that are pushed around, is this a portable bin? So we don't know necessarily what zone it's in. We know where it should be, but that may not be if it's a portable bin where it is today. The next one was our sequence up here, and the sequence is so that we can sort our inventory pick list by a logical sneaker path through the inventory warehousing shelves. So as I go down the first aisle, I may have bins A on the right and bins B on the left. My sequence would be bin A1 and B1 would be 1 and 2. Bin 2 would be the next sequence. This way, when I walk down the aisle, I pull parts off of left and right while I'm walking that path. Then when I get to the end of the aisle, I turn, I come back down the next aisle. I can set the sequence of those bins to be the logical walk that an inventory clerk would be making as they go through the inventory warehouse. When I print a material pick list for jobs or a sales order pick list or my material queue, I can sort these by that sequence so that I'm not running around the warehouse from point A to point Z back to point B. I can now make one logical path and I have all of my inventory picks in the shortest time it takes to walk. If your employees are having Fitbit challenges, don't use the sequence. They want to keep their steps up, that's awesome. If they're looking to maximize their time, go ahead and use the sequence so that they're not running around like an atomic particle. Bin types. Is it a standard? Is it a customer bin? Is this a vendor managed? And over on the right, if you have the module or the feature with the software, you can specify this bin is for this customer and pick who it is, or it's for this supplier. That inventory is going to be handled differently when we do transactions because it's customer managed or vendor managed. It's not necessarily something you should have to manage. Next is our location for the bin. Prior to the sequence, this is how people would say it's in this aisle, it's this direction facing, and it's at this elevation. The elevation is still helpful only because when I walk the aisles with a push cart, I can pull anything that's less than 6 feet down. If it's on the third shelf up by the ceiling, I may need a cherry picker or a forklift. So I may want to be able to not only sort by sequence, but sort by that elevation so that I can know I need to drive a forklift down this aisle to pull the inventory. For our fulfillment system, anybody using advanced material management module, there is a wave replenishable. At what point do I bring max refill? What is my percent fillable? So that when I say I have my supermarket of inventory here, but on the line, I want to have 100 pieces of this item all the time. The second that drops below, Epicor will create a suggestion for the inventory clerk to move parts from the supermarket down to the assembly line. Again, this requires the advanced material management module, but it's a great way to keep the supermarket filling down to the different lines where inventory is. Next thing, if you are looking at bins in the classic mode, you are not going to see the attributes. This was added in the Kinetic world, so it is only on the Kinetic UI, but I can attach custom attributes to a bin to specify additional parameters. This is a picking bin. This is a frozen products bin, what type it is. And you can control these attributes and then choose what you want as the attribute on the bin when you set them up. So our warehouses would be set up. We would have our bins in our warehouses. We would have our sequencing put in so that we can walk the aisles in a logical path and pick the inventory as quick as possible. Cycle counting, when we do inventory cycle counting in Epicor, we're not doing full physical wall to wall. When I set up a cycle count, it is per warehouse. If I have everything in one warehouse, when I do my cycle counting, I'm counting the whole place. If I break my warehouses up into their different types of products, now I can have different cycle counting rules and set up different cycle counts for my items. Would I need to run a cycle count on the raw material warehouse? Shouldn't need to, but I may need to do cycle counting on my raw materials and my finished goods. Being able to set up cycle counting would require different warehouses if we want to have different rules. If I have an obsolete warehouse, I probably don't need to do daily cycle counts on inventory that doesn't move. If it's not broken into its own warehouse, I can't change the cycle counting rule for those parts. In addition, the price lists allow for us to turn around and put parts in specific warehouses. So if I'm doing sales, I can have overstock sitting in a separate warehouse but attach a different price. So if sales is selling from overstock, it may be at a 10% discount. If you want brand new product, that's at full price. If it's obsolete inventory, I may want to have a different warehouse for obsolete that we liquidate that at 50% of cost or of sale price so that we can turn around and get rid of that obsolete. Those price lists can be tied to specific parts in specific warehouses. So Warehousing also ties in with sales. When they book a sales order, on that order release tab, there's a drop down for where they want to pull the inventory from. If they pick one of these warehouses, it's also going to update the price that was put onto the sales order to match the price on the price list that it's within. In addition to all of this, parts and part tracker. If we add multiple warehouses inside part maintenance, we need to set the part up in the warehouses where it can exist. If we only have one main warehouse, then the parts are much easier to manage. But if I'm going to have parts that exist in Maine, I'm going to have them existing in a supermarket. Then I'm also going to have them in obsolete. I need to add the warehouse to the part site tab to make sure that I can control inventory at any one of those three locations. If the warehouse is not set up on the part, you can't put any parts into that warehouse. So if you do go with multiple warehouses, you need to remember to update your part settings so that each warehouse that you want this part to exist in, Epicor can track it. Next one is the quantity bearing. If we want to track inventory, it's got to be a quantity bearing part. If it's not quantity bearing, Epicor is not going to set up the inventory structure to be able to track how many are in each warehouse and bin. The quantity bearing allows us to turn around and track an on-hand quantity in the plant. It'll track the on-hand quantity in the warehouse, and it'll track the on-hand quantity in the bin. Periodically, those numbers will get out of sync. When you start seeing this in your job tracker, there is a conversion program under manufacturing distribution that will revalidate your on-hand inventory counts to keep the three different locations synchronous. I know we covered an awful lot of information here in 25 minutes, but this is covering the entire setup from getting the company configured, setting up your warehouses and bins, and then how does that information interact with various areas within the software. Okay, I mean, there's not a lot to warehousing and bins. The areas that I hit are the full coverage throughout the system.
It looks like we
Sorry
have a
for
question
going.
from Tony.
How do you mean with a job, Tony? The job is going to look to the resource group, and the resource group has an input and an output warehouse and bin. If those are blank on the output warehouse and bin, it's going to go back to the primary warehouse and bin that is set up on the part. So when I issue material, I'm going to take it from my raw material warehouse and issue it to a job that's going into work in process. I generally recommend we set up a warehouse called floor or a bin called floor, and that's where we move the parts to. We're not necessarily going to know where they are on the floor other than the job that they're linked to. So if they're linked to CNC, hopefully they're over in the CNC department. When they come out of CNC, they're going to have an output bin that they go to, or they're moving to the next operation on the job, which would still be on the floor. When they come off of the job, they would end up going to wherever the put away was done. So the manufacturing receipt, we have to tell it what warehouse and bin we put those parts into. If we have a finished goods warehouse, it's much easier to say they came from manufacturing, they went to finished goods, and we put them in bin one. And Joe W., for sequencing, each bin needs its own sequence number. Yes, I find it easier to do that. Can you make bins be the same sequence number? Yes. So the ones on the right and the left, but then if you ever reposition where that bin is or move the aisle, you now got to go in and separate and update all your sequence numbers. See, so how would a company know whether it's a bin or a warehouse? So in shipping, we have two sides, one for outsourcing, other for to customer. So in your shipping department, you have a subcontract bin, and it sounds like you have a customer product or an outbound customer shipment. So that should be fine having two bins in there. When we pull inventory for a customer, we put it onto the one side. When we're receiving a job that goes to subcontract, we put it on the other. We would just need the inventory clerk to specify, I put it on side A or side B. I don't recall offhand if sequence, we got another question, is the sequence capable of handling alpha characters? That I'd have to take a look at field help. I thought it was just numbers, but it could be alpha characters in there as well. I wouldn't see why Epicor put it in there. It might be a little bit more difficult for sorting because then it's going to go alpha sort rather than numeric sort. We may want the sequencing to be pulled by numeric. Now, you can say finished goods is all in the sequences of 1 to 500. Raw materials, we're going to sequence at 1,000. This way, you make sure that when you sort your pull list, they're grouped by the type of inventory if you don't want to break the warehouses apart. Chase, did you learn anything fun today?
I learned quite a bit. I knew some stuff about warehousing and bins from our experience with one of our clients. Didn't know too much about how the sequencing and all that works, so it was interesting to learn.
Normally, when I have customers do sequence, I have them do an aerial view map of their warehouses
Hmm.
and then draw the sneaker path on the printout. And then that's how you assign your sequence numbers because you have to lay down a physical visual of what's my sneaker path so that you can assign the sequences right.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And would that be per job then, for like where the part
No,
is, or?
that would
Okay.
be for the whole plant. Then when we
Okay.
print the pick list for a job, we sort it by sequence number. And then once they make one path, they've got all their parts.
Everybody have a good rest of your day and week, and we'll be back next week.
Awesome. Sounds great. Happy lunch.
Have a good one. Bye.